Okay, everyone. Today we're going to look at indirect questions. Indirect questions are questions that are inside another sentence. We don't ask them directly. We usually use them to sound more polite, more formal, or more careful, especially when we talk to people we don't know well or in professional situations. Let's start by looking at the difference between direct questions and indirect questions. Direct questions are the questions we use with friends, family, or people we know well. They are short and direct. For example, where is the bus station? Or did you enjoy the film yesterday? In direct questions, we usually use inversion, which means the verb comes before the subject. Now, let's look at indirect questions. We use indirect questions when we want to be more polite or less direct. These questions usually start with an introductory phrase, such as, can you tell me? Could you tell me? Do you know? I was wondering. Or I'd like to know. After this introductory phrase, we add the real question, but the structure changes. This is the most important rule. In indirect questions, we do not use inversion. The sentence after the introductory phrase follows the normal word order of a positive sentence. Subject plus verb. For example, the direct question, where is the bank, becomes, can you tell me where the bank is? Notice that the bank follows normal sentence order. The same rule applies to yes-no questions. In direct yes-no questions, we use auxiliary verbs like do, did, or is. For example, is he English? Or did they go to the cinema? To make these questions indirect, we use if or whether, and again we use normal word order. For example, do you know if he is English? Or do you know whether they went to the cinema? Now let's look at what questions. With what questions we keep the question word, but we change the word order. For example, where does he live? Becomes, can you tell me where he lives? Another example is, what time do they open? Becoming, do you know what time they open? Again, there is no inversion in the indirect question. It's also important to pay attention to punctuation. When we use expressions like, can you tell me? Could you tell me? Or, do you know? We usually use a question mark at the end of the sentence, because the whole sentence is still a question. For example, could you tell me where the clinic is? However, when we use expressions like I was wondering, or I'd like to know, we usually do not use a question mark because these are statements. For example, I was wondering where the clinic is. Indirect questions can be used with different verb tenses, and the rule is always the same, no inversion. For example, in the present simple, what time do they open becomes, do you know what time they open? In the past simple, how did you meet your wife becomes I'd like to know how you met your wife. In the past continuous, what were you doing yesterday afternoon becomes, could you tell me what you were doing yesterday afternoon? Let's now connect this grammar with some vocabulary about health problems, which is a very common context for polite questions. For example, can you tell me where the clinic is? Or I was wondering if the doctor is available. We can also ask, do you know whether he is recovering well? Or could you tell me why she is unwell today? These questions sound much more polite and appropriate in formal or professional situations. So to finish, remember these key ideas. We use indirect questions to be polite, we don't use inversion after the introductory phrase, and we often use if or whether for yes-no questions. If you focus on keeping the sentence in normal word order, indirect questions become much easier to use.